and you're listening to My Alien Life.
I was there. At the time, I didn't know it. Another person and I been acquainted with the Wright-Patterson archivist, and he had a clearance where you could go anyplace. And he invited this other person and I to a UFO meeting. But this one particular building was different because it had, and I was real impressed. I didn't know anything about the building at that time. I just knew its name and number and everything. That was the building that was the Blue Room. And so we had been in the Blue Room and we didn't even know it.
My guest tonight has inside information with real documents that include hidden studies showing that UFOs really exist. Her explanation of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base includes interviews with top researchers, photographs showing hidden views, bodies in crypts, and visits to its famous Blue Room. Tonight, in the studio, Sacred Corridors, and my special guest is Dr. Irena Scott. That and more is coming right up on My Alien Life. My Alien Life is recorded live from atop the Northern Rocky Mountains and is available on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, and everywhere fine podcasts are found. My website is at www.myalienlifepodcast.com. There you will find my email address, all previously recorded shows, and more. I am Cameron Brower. This is My Alien Life, and the podcast starts right now.
My Alien Life Podcast.
Three, two, 1, 0, 0, and liftoff.
My guest tonight has actually walked down the sacred corridors and hidden passageways where UFO studies have taken place and where she worked in several crucial UFO investigation agencies. Dr. Scott has been a biologist, a ufologist, and an author of at least 6 books, half of them dealing with UFOs and all things related. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Irena Scott. Thank you so much for joining me, and welcome.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm very glad to be here, and it sounds really interesting.
Indeed, a pleasure to have you. I've been wanting to have you. I've read a couple of your books, and I haven't read the latest, but I'm going to read that one too. And, you know, I felt it was important to mention your science background tonight because that's so meaningful. And can you tell me what it means stepping into the UFO world with information that is factual and data-driven?
Yes, I think having an academic background has helped me in several ways. For one thing, I've been able to publish some UFO data in the scientific literature and the peer-reviewed literature, and I think that really helps helps people to think of it as being scientific and factual rather than just some type of flim-flam. And also, I've done a lot of research, and I'm used to doing research, and so I document everything I do and things like that, and try to calculate and, see if I'm off on a tangent or doing something that makes sense and logic and that sort of thing.
And I want to mention, too, that you have a very solid scientific background. You attended Ohio State, University of Nevada, Missouri, Cornell, and you're also at one time an assistant professor in biology. So that's very, very meaningful. You are also a correspondent for Popular Mechanics magazine. So when you incorporate those things individually into one thing, and when you study UFOs, I mean, that's a big deal. So anything that you've written in the past, how has it been taken by the scientific community, and what kind of feedback have you gotten?
I've corresponded with several scientists. One of them was Dr. Harley Rutledge. He was a person that really impressed me. Have you heard of him?
Yeah.
And I think he did an extremely good study of UFOs because he was out in the field and actually studying them in real time, which he's a Ph.D. professor in physics. And so he could do, the things that, like figure out whether they, how odd they were and whether they were airplanes or odd airplanes or something else. And they did just a remarkable study of coming across things like why you have trouble photographing them, and why they do things like they set up stations and they would watch the UFOs fly over, and sometimes they'd avoid the stations and things like that. And so he did just a really good study and said that they may know what people are saying or know what people are thinking and adjust their behavior to that. It was kind of like a field study of animal behavior, but it was of UFOs, and it was just excellent. It's called Project Identification. I think the book's real hard to get and expensive.
So was there a conclusion of why it's so hard to study the UFO phenomenon and UFOs themselves?
Yes, because, for example, when they try to take pictures, they don't come out a lot of times. And he'd say that sometimes they'd aim the camera and the things would just disappear or go someplace else. And sometimes the pictures just didn't turn out. And that sort of thing that makes it very, very difficult to study them, because scientists expect, if you take a picture of something, it's there and it should photograph. But that's not the way UFOs do a lot of times. And so that's a reason why they're not accepted very well. But he did an intensive study and had other observers and scientific instruments too, to show that they were really taking pictures and they didn't turn out and that sort of thing. So it was pretty good.
And I've actually attempted, and I've talked about this on other shows, but attempted to take pictures of things that I've witnessed in the past as well. And it's one of those things, especially even with technology now, which usually everybody carries with them. And we didn't do that 20 years ago or 40 years ago, but with the technology that we carry with us, we're still photographing an object at some distance, which appears in the focal field of the phone or the camera as a very small defined object. So number one, usually you have a limited time to actually photograph it. And number two, it becomes particularly hard to find, in your viewfinder, especially when there's a lot of excitement, things like that involved. So, to me, it's never been a really big mystery of why it's so hard to photograph.
Yeah, I take a lot of wildlife pictures, too, just for a hobby. And it reminds me of taking pictures of wildlife because you don't know when it's going to show up. You have to instantly take a picture. And with a UFO, you may be so amazed that you just stand there and don't do anything. And the UFO or the wildlife will get out of the way real fast sometimes. So it's very difficult. And it's difficult to even control yourself I try to take wildlife pictures, and I keep telling myself, if I see something, take a picture before I think. But, I usually think, and then it's too late and the animals run away or something. And the same for UFO photography. If you see something that weird, you're just astounded, and you don't take the picture, which is a big problem.
Right. I think one of the other things too is the fact that you're witnessing this and you want to witness it, and you struggle with two sides of yourself: one that wants to take the picture, and the other side that wants to actually witness this. And I think the witness side of the brain wins usually because as we haven't seen a lot of really good photography of that. And I do know also that you brought up the fact of wildlife photography, and I live next to a bird refuge and some wetlands. And these photographers who, are taking pictures of birds as moving objects in the sky, take thousands of photos, and get maybe one or two that they consider a good quality photograph. So it's very, very difficult, even wildlife that we see every day.
I know today I was walking out I live on a farm, and I was walking out through the field, and there were a couple of low buzzards. I think they were going to build a nest, and a hawk. And I was trying to get a picture of all three of them, but I didn't succeed. But I did get some good buzzard pictures. It was just interesting to try to get all three types of animals.
So you are my fifth or sixth professor I've had on the program, and each one of you have had a different focus on preferred subgenres in ufology, if you will. What are your interests, and what do you bring different to the table?
What I bring different is that I work for the government, and so I was actually working in some of the places where some of the UFO studies took place. For example, I worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency for several years, and I was in photo interpretation and photogrammetry. And this isn't what you'd call UFO work, but it was satellite photography, and we were supposed to identify all the airplanes, anything in the air over this particular area, so that I had a good idea of what happens in the DIA and, the type of photography they use and that sort of thing. I also worked at Battelle Memorial Institute, and it did a real good study under Project Blue Book of Spatial Report number 14. And this is a study of UFOs. And I knew some of the people that sort of peripherally worked in, it was real classified, but that, knew the people and that sort of thing. And I've also been sent to Wright-Patterson for work-related things, like for attending conferences and stuff. And so most of Wright-Patterson is very, very, very secure. And it's not a place where UFO, it's probably the mecca of ufology, because it's where Project Blue Book took place, and it's where the Roswell material went. And I think there's good documentation for that, and where Hangar 18 is and all that. But nobody's been there. But I was lucky enough to be on site several times and look around, took pictures and that sort of thing.
Your book, Sacred Corridors, is an insider's guide that takes us through places like Wright-Patterson that you just mentioned, and even looks into Project Blue Book and defense intelligence. So what's the main idea and purpose, and what did you hope to convey by writing the book, Sacred Corridors?
Well, for one thing, there's a lot of informant material, all kinds of books of informant material about Wright-Patterson, such as Carey and Smith and Leonard Stringfield, and a lot of things about crisis, and that there's bodies and UFOs and debris and everything stored at Wright-Patterson. Well, I hadn't been in too many of the buildings of Inners, but I had driven around, and for what they call Hangar 18, would ask people around Dayton and things what it is, and they had told me a different thing than what's usually in the book. Said there's hangars there, big hangars, and they said that one of those had been Hangar 18, and I think that was logical because back in 1947, when the Roswell debris might have been coming in, well, the runway was by those hangars. And so I think what he said made sense, and I was able to get some close-up pictures of the hangar, the front and the back, and some of the airplanes around it. Of course, didn't get in it, but I just suggested that maybe that was Hangar 18. And then they usually say that Building 18 is what's Hangar 18. And I was able to drive around and look at Building 18. There's a story that it's next to a building called Hangar 23 or Building 23. And the informant story is that there's parts of a UFO or a whole UFO in the basement of Building 23. And that they also did studies of that in Building 18 or Hangar 18, which is right beside it. And there's stories that they dug a tunnel from one building to the other, and then they can do studies and take samples back between the buildings. And so I took pictures of the buildings, and I didn't get inside it, but the windows are blocked on the side of Building 18 that's beside 23, which kind of makes you wonder. And then I also heard stories of a person that did go into Building 18. She didn't know it was Building 18, and she just made a stop and took some kids in and didn't know anything about it. She said when she came out that there were military guys pointing guns at them, and so that would sort of suggest too that it was highly secure.
So how do they keep Wright-Patterson secret? And, well, I should say, how do they keep their secrets within Wright-Patterson, and how is security there different from other bases other Air Force bases around the country?
Well, my first experience with Wright-Patterson was when I was a real young kid, grade school. And my parents, Wright-Patterson has the Air Force Museum, and it's the top Air Force museum in the country. And it's a public thing. And so people think of it as just family friend. Wright-Patterson is sort of a family friendly place. And they don't realize that all the rest of Wright-Patterson is surrounded by chain link fences and guard posts and guards, armed guards and everything else. And when I went as a kid, my sister and I, our parents took us, and we were going to see the Air Force Museum. And my father got lost and wound up circling around Wright-Patterson for a while, and we finally came in this group of buildings, and we were sort of trapped in them. And suddenly 5 military guys came out with rifles and pointed them right through our car windows and told us to leave. And my father didn't always obey orders, but he decided to that time. And so we survived, and then we found eventually found the museum. But that could impress you quite a bit when you're young, that there's a lot of security around that place. And the same type of thing happened not too long ago. It was in the newspaper. A woman and her mother and kids, the grandmother and the mother and the kids, went to see the Air Force Museum and came out. And in the parking lot, armed guards came and made them get out of the car and made them stand on their knees while they were holding guns on them. And so, and that was in the paper. I gave a reference in the paper book, but there's a lot of security around the place. Everything except the Air Force Museum is surrounded by big, tall chain link fences and guard posts with all kinds of guards and bars and everything you can think of. But it's very secure.
Like Area 51, there's hundreds of civilians, and I've brought this up too to people like Richard Doty. Hundreds of people who work there, and they do everything from maintenance to electrical and custodial work. Is there a way to keep these people from seeing things, or is there just a way of keeping these people quiet?
Well, you see, it's just mainly informant data that there's things there. I think if there are debris and artifacts and everything, they would be in particular places. They wouldn't be where just the janitors and everything go. They would be in secured places. And so I don't think most people that work there would know.
Okay.
I think if you just worked there, you'd work in an office and you might not. If there is that sort of thing, I think it'd be very secure. I mean, the government is very compartmentalized. And
I know that there's a lot of people there that experience different parts of the base on a need-to-know basis, and of course, that's not unusual. But you would think that with all the people that are in and out of there on a daily basis, there would just be so much more information. Do you know of any faction that actually works within the confines of the base that is responsible for keeping track of these people and making sure that they stay silent about the activities there?
No, I understand Leonard Stringfield, the way he studied it is, if you go down to Dayton, and once I was just in a restaurant and I had a UFO book and I was with somebody else and we were just kind of joking around. Somebody came up and said, "Oh, well, his uncle worked at Wright-Patterson. He knew where the debris was and where the bodies were and everything else." And you can go around Dayton. People just come up and tell you that, but it's always secondhand. It's not, I actually saw that myself usually. If their uncle or their kid.
So they must be doing a very, very good job at keeping people silent on that, because it's one of those things that's so unusual. It just seemingly that people would love to tell that story, although there is a stigma attached to telling those stories.
Mm-hmm. And actually, have you heard of the Blue Room?
I have heard of the Blue Room. Tell me about the Blue Room and talk about that, because that's very interesting.
I was there.
Really?
At the time, I didn't know it. Another person I knew, I had been acquainted with the archive, the Wright-Patterson archivist, and he had a clearance where you could go any place. And he invited this other person and I to a UFO meeting. And it was in this building, and I had been there at conferences and stuff, and I was totally impressed with the building to start with. And what was different about the building is that Wright-Patterson, like I said, is surrounded by, the main part of Wright-Patterson is surrounded by chain link fences and guard posts and everything. And so the buildings are fairly secure. Well, this one particular building, I had noticed that when I'd been on conferences and things, that this one particular building was different because it had like cameras all around the roof and little devices all around the building and just all kinds of security, everything you could think of. So and none of the other buildings had that. And when we went to the meeting, we went in that building. And I was real impressed. I didn't know anything about the building at that time. I just knew its name and number and everything. But later, in a book by Terry and Smith, they said that that FIOA document that somebody asked that that was the building that was the Blue Room. And so we had been in the Blue Room and we didn't even know it.
So what year was this that you were in the Blue Room?
It was in the around, I think, 1994. But it was years and years. It was, just recently I discovered that was considered the Blue Room.
Right. And I had heard too that that the Blue Room was used through the 60s and earlier. And there wasn't a lot of information after that. So I was one of those things that that always kind of stuck out in my mind, and I was always wondering if that still existed, if they moved it, if they're still using it for that kind of storage, or to me, I would think that if they had established this blue room and it was for what they say it was for, that would be something that would be of ultra high security, and that probably wouldn't go away, because there's material kept there that would be very sacred to national security as well as posterity and history. So wouldn't you think that would still exist, or still exist today? Does that make sense?
Well, it was certainly different from every other building I saw at Wright-Patterson, because none of them had security like that. And, I'd have been a lot more impressed that somebody called it the Blue Room from Wright-Patterson. But I didn't know that when I went in, and I was just totally impressed by, all the cameras and everything, the security that was amazing. And I just got in because this man took us both in, and we went to a meeting on UFOs, surprisingly enough. It was the last day he worked there too. He was being daring and took us in. And so it was pretty thrilling, especially when I found out what it was. But apparently, if there's something there, it's probably in the basement or something like that, in a secured area, because the part I saw was just, like, it looked like office building. I don't think, office or labs or things like that. It was a real big building. There were all kinds of parts of it. And
that would actually be one of the crown jewel rooms of the U.S. government. It's seemingly that is there good information? Is there good intelligence to say that most of the UFO debris that we've collected in the United States is at Wright-Patterson in that room?
Oh, I don't know, because you just have informants, and like I said, you can go to Dayton and everybody will tell you all kinds of things. I guess they've moved it to Area 51 and probably other places, so I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised, if there's something, if they do have debris, that maybe it's there, some of it, because there's pretty good documentation that that the debris from Roswell went to Wright-Patterson.
I don't want to give up anything about sacred corridors, but I do want to know the first chapter of the book called Future Human Evolution or Armageddon. What does that mean?
Just that we don't know what is going on in our future, but that UFOs are something that is probably important. That's why it's so much, people pay so much attention to it. And, there's all kinds of theories about what are they and what's our future and that sort of thing. And I think that's why there's so much public attention on UFOs, is because that may be, meeting beings from other planets or other types of beings or other life forms may be a real important thing in our future. And we may be experiencing some of it now.
Tell me about the timeliness of the book.
The timeliness is that it was published right before the Project Blue Book came on the History Channel last year. And so I tried to get it out before that. And it, I had a lot about Project Blue Book in it.
And what kind of new information did you bring?
I had, for one thing, I had the study that Battelle Memorial did, the Battelle Memorial Institute did for Project Blue Book. And this was official report number 14, where they did a statistical study of UFOs. And this was a real good scientific study, and it may be the best that was ever done, because they actually hired scientists. It was secret, and the only reason anybody found out about it was because of a whistleblower. But they hired Battelle Memorial Institute to do it, and I knew people that knew the people that had been involved with the study. And what was interesting about the study was that kind of just about proved that UFOs exist, but people don't know anything about it because it's a very scientific statistical study. If you open it up, you just see this statistics and graphs and everything, and you don't really understand it. And they weren't clear at all about explaining things, but they did this statistical study of where they took witness reports for UFOs, and they had a lot of them, like from Project Blue Book, and they develop a questionnaire where you can, in order to where they can get precise information from people that observed UFOs. And there's lots of discrete things you can say, like what color are they? How many are there? Is there a sound? And different things like that. So they did this really good questionnaire. They put the information into a computer and analyzed it, and they compared the UFOs that remained unexplained and compared them to UFOs that were later identified or called identified flying objects. And there was a huge statistical difference all the way through. Like, they calculated in 5 or 6 categories, like things like color and how many and how long did you watch it, things like that. There was a huge statistical difference between the ones that might be called real UFOs that were never identified and ones that were later identified, which showed basically statistically that UFOs are not just misidentifications of regular things.
You've done some extensive studying on Project Blue Book, and according to those who know, the Project Blue Book had 2 goals. One was to determine if UFOs were a threat to national security, and another one was to scientifically analyze UFO-related data. Do you believe that Project Blue Book was really terminated in 1970, and why would that be? Because there was so much still to learn about information about back engineering and things like that would help our national security.
Yeah, what they did was apparently that for some reason I kind of had paperwork that went right up to the end. And it was surprising when they ended it because they were getting some really good data. And right then they decided to end it for unknown reasons. And the way they ended it was the Robertson panel and then the Condon report. And both of those were pretty fake. The Robertson panel, they chose some really well-known, outstanding scientists, but ones that didn't know anything about UFOs. And I had paperwork for that from different people. What they did was the Robertson panel was supposed to study the Battelle study on UFOs, and the Battelle study wasn't finished. And they had papers I showed some documents from people such as the president of Battelle and things that said, the data isn't finished, don't do the study. And so they did it anyway and declared that UFOs are a threat to national security and tried to close it down. In the same way for the Condon Committee, they studied Project Blue Book data and said there's no threat to national security. Well, they couldn't even explain 1/3 of the data. and it just was a whitewash, both of them.
Do you think they really ended the program, or did they just rename it and reclassify it?
I think, well, from my work at the Defense Intelligence Agency, I think they keep information on every flying object in enemy territory. I imagine they do it all over the world. They, from, the spy satellites, the spy in the sky. Well, they have those up and working all the time. And so if there's UFOs, I'm sure they have photographs of them just like they do of anything, of all the airplanes. And so I think that like the DIA would have information on UFOs, but I think it would be compartmentalized.
Just seems to me if there was an announcement that they actually ended it and it was so secretive to begin with, there may have been alternative motives involved there. It's hard for me to believe that could possibly go away when it was so hugely important.
I know. I mean, like when I was working at the DIA, well, I found out my supervisors found what they thought was a UFO on their the photography we were using, which was satellite photography. And they reported it as a UFO. And I saw it, and it looked like it was a thing that looked like a domed thing. It was flying. It was over water. It was on two different missions. And I could enlarge it and change its size and get it in stereo and things like that. And my supervisor was just amazed because they reported it as a UFO, and it wasn't anything we'd ever seen before. Well, their supervisors told them that it was an imperfection on the film, which was just ridiculous because it was on two different films and you could see it in stereo. And they were just amazed that, they got that from their supervisors. But that made me think that, yes, there's someplace up there, above we had a real high clearance. We had some of the top clearances, but the compartmentalized type of security, the clearances. But they told us that my supervisors, I think one was a GS-14 or something, that the photography that we saw just wasn't what we saw. So I think there's somebody up above where we were that handles that sort of thing.
Can you talk about special report number 14?
It was done by Battelle Memorial Institute, and
so they're a think tank from Columbus, Ohio. Is that something that regularly contracted with the Air Force or the military, and how did they get involved?
It's kind of unclear. They're not a think tank. They're a research organization. They're a real high top research organization. They developed Xeroxy and a lot of different things like that. And one reason they got into it, one reason, of course, I think it's because it's close to Wright-Patterson, and it's also close to Ohio State. And they wanted a secret study done. And Battelle has real top scientists. And surprisingly enough, the president of Battelle, whose name was Clyde Williams, he took on the project. And at that time, it would sort of make you look like you're nuts because UFO people were considered crazy and all that, to have a big, important scientific research organization study UFOs. And so they didn't want the world to know, and it was secret. And then it was secret because I think it was the need of Project Blue Book, but Project Blue Book was basically kind of debunking UFOs all the way along, but at the same time they were doing this secret study, top secret, of the characteristics of UFOs. And the president of Battelle took on the project. And the president of Battelle had been there when, it was Clyde Williams, he had been there when the Roswell debris came in. And so that's how they got into it. And what was interesting was that it was supposed to be a study that studied UFOs statistically, and they were to develop a questionnaire which will pull out the real hardcore information about UFOs from witnesses. And so what they wanted was, what you'd think they would use would be maybe psychologists or people that knew something about how to do questionnaire and statisticians. But what they wound up hiring were metallurgists, and people at Battelle were certainly surprised at that because it didn't have a thing to do with metallurgy, and it looked like the people that they knew that had something to do with it were metallurgists. And so there was a lot of question about whether maybe they had analyzed debris. But it was, and there was that question, and people wondered. And then what we had reported, I had reported in a couple of my books, was that people had wondered about that. And I had found somebody that was a scientist, a metallurgist, that had quit there, but he had told somebody that he worked on artifacts from UFOs that came from New Mexico, and described what he worked on, and said yes, he did. I mean, he didn't, obviously this was just an informal conversation, but I talked to the people that talked to him. And so we reported on that too, because that was the first indication anybody had that maybe they had actually worked on debris instead of just doing that study.
One of the things that strikes me is they did their statistical analysis on cases that were evaluated on 6 different characteristics: the color, number, duration of observation, brightness, shape, and speed of different sightings. To me, that data seems very, very skewed, only in the way because of the sample and how they would actually collect that sample. Where were they getting these cases and the information? And I understand how they broke it down and were compiling it and trying to categorize it, but where were they getting all this information in the first place to plug it into these punch card computers?
From the questionnaire, they would ask a lot of questions like, what color? And that's fairly discreet. I mean, it's not something that, you would say, well, it might be one color. You can tell what color it is, whether it's blue or orange or purple. And the number, well, it's reasonably discreet, whether you see 1 or 3 or something. And the duration, they ask for is this like under 5 minutes or over 5 minutes or something like that. And so I think they had some discrete things. And what they did was compare those statistically to between the ones that were never identified and the ones that were identified. And they did come out, they used chi-square, which is a good statistical method. And there were highly significant differences in 5 of the 6 categories.
I guess I'm wondering where they got the samples. I mean, did they actually hear of sightings and go track these people all over the continent to try to figure out what they actually saw?
They got them from the questionnaire that they had people fill out for Project Blue Book. And that was a huge amount of data.
So,
I mean, it was,
I would like to, it would be very interesting to see, what would the actual questionnaire and what it looked like. And unfortunately, we'll probably never, ever know.
I suspect it looked like the ones that the Center for UFO Studies was doing. I should have published a picture of that, but they had you fill out a narrative of what happened. And then they asked questions like, if you hold up a dime at arm's length, how does that compare to its size? And ask discrete questions such as how many do you see and what color and that sort of thing. It was about 4 pages. It had a lot of questions.
Do you feel there's any relationship now with entities that are doing research in UFO activity and that original, what am I trying to say? I'm sorry. I want to know if there's any relationship between the research that was done then and the compilation of all that data. And is there any research data now that's being compiled by different entities like MUFON? Are they related in any way? And is that any of that information being kept track of by the Air Force, the government, or whoever is keeping track of UFOs now?
I don't know that it is. A person named Cheryl Costa wrote a book recently about statistical analysis of UFOs, and she just took different states and said, what hours do you see the most and what seasons are the most sightings and things like that. I don't know of a study. This would be a really good study, but I don't know anybody that's done it like that.
That original Project Blue Book special report number 14, does it contain any actual proof that the UFO phenomenon is real?
I think statistically that's the best you could do, actually, because everything, if somebody takes a picture, all the debunkers will say it's fake no matter what. And I think the best you could do is analyze the empirical data of people's sightings. And that's what was done. And, like if there was nothing to it, well, I don't think it would be statistically different.
Why is that?
For example, if you see an airplane, it has standard lighting like white, red, and green. But if you see something blue or purple or something like that, it's not standard airplane lighting. And so it's going to show up statistically. I think if you have a vast amount of data, and they had a vast amount of data, I think they had started out with 13,000 reports, and they culled it down to get the best ones and used that statistically.
I think one of the things that are different right now than were different in 1970 is how we can treat that data. I mean, there's so much of it, and it would be so valuable to pour into supercomputers that are capable of looking at it from a different point of view, I think, right now.
Well, the government may be doing that, but I don't know, I think it'd be a good study, and it'd be nice to do. I don't know if any of the group like MUFON or anything, because they're just not funded like the government was. And it took, they asked for the money in that case and got some from the government to do the study.
Well, that's a good point, because even back then it cost plenty to be able to analyze that data and have that many staff on hand to look at it.
Yeah, and these are professional people too.
So were these people that were looking at this data, was this a day job, or did they were they employed elsewhere at the same time in order to make ends meet, because it wasn't a program that was around? You know, everybody's kind of cut loose after 1970, apparently.
Yeah. This study was done by Battelle employees, and I tried to find out who did the study, and I couldn't find out because they didn't list the people that did the study. They just listed people that knew about it, such as the supervisors, and the only reason they found out that was due to a whistleblower that told that let people know about some of the documents. But I was unable to find out who did the actual study. But they were people employed by Battelle that, and Battelle got grant money for doing it. But they weren't, that's what was odd about it, was so far as you could tell, the people that you knew about were metallurgists, which seemed very strange for the study that was done. It wasn't a metallurgical study.
Can you talk about Hynek and his criticism of Project Blue Book in the report?
Yeah, he was originally hired as a debunker, and so they'd roll him out, and when there was a UFO sighting, he'd say, "Oh, it's Venus" or something. And he thought when he started, I think he probably sort of thought it was Flim Flam, but I think the reason they hired him wasn't just because he was saying he's skeptical. He had some clearances too. He'd been working for the government and other things, but then he was extremely open-minded about things. And after hearing reports and talking to people and analyzing everything, he thought that there was something to it, even though Blue Book was saying, "Oh, no, you're all, everybody's crazy" and all that. And so after Blue Book stopped, he was a professor at Northwestern. Well, he founded the Center for UFO Studies and tried to set it up as a scientific organization, and got Ph.D. scientists and good high-level people, and set it up so that they'd have like scientific peer-reviewed reports and things like that, just like a regular scientific society.
So what kind of employee was he of this system? Was he was he valuable? Was he hard to deal with? Actually, he was probably a well-paid person and a very good consultant. But how did he? What was the reaction of his handlers?
Well, I had documents that told about Hynek from. You see, there were people above him that had higher clearances that knew that were doing that actual study that was secret, and he didn't know about it. And at that time, he didn't have the clearances that some of the rest of them did, and so he knew that he wasn't getting all the information, which he couldn't do anything about, and he stuck it out because he wanted to find out everything he could, regardless of what was going on, and he stayed in it. But he was a professor at OSU at that time, and that's probably another reason why he got the job, was because OSU was close to Wright-Patterson, and then he became a professor at Northwestern later, and I think he was the head of the department too. But he was a successful professor, and he did high-level astronomy too, because he was an astronomer and a professor in astronomy, and so that was his main job. And so that when he was a consultant to Blue Book, and they were paying him, but that wasn't his main job. He was a professor.
He had criticized the incompetence and shoddy research in part of Air Force personnel. Any idea what he actually saw there that really irritated him?
Yeah, I think the fact that they were debunking perfectly good stories about UFOs, I think, had something to do with it. I had in my book, I had a lot of, quite a number of his actual handwritten letters that he wrote. And you could tell he was taking it seriously, that he was very interested, and he was especially interested in reports from scientists. And, where they had some analytical training and, studied these things. And that's not what Blue Book did. That Blue Book had, somebody'd say, well, I saw this UFO, maybe it hovered and moved up and down or something. And then Blue Book would say, oh, you saw Venus. Well, that irritated him.
I know that he was very critical of Sergeant David Moody, who he called the master of possible, because of the debunking, which they would label things as possible balloons and possible aircraft and birds. And so was this part of the undoing of Project Blue Book, or was it just destined to be a short-lived program?
I think when they started, it started as Project Sign before it went into Blue Book. And I think there was some scientific analysis in that, and they came to the conclusion that UFOs might be extraterrestrial. Well, then it turned into Project Grudge, and that turned into Project Blue Book. And apparently the higher-ups wanted to debunk UFOs. And, it was purported to be a scientific study, and the top secret part of it was a scientific study. But it wasn't the part that the public knew about. The public, they were having people debunk it. And there was a real good sighting here. It was called the Portage County sighting. It was by a policeman named Spar, and I think it's Nesbitt or something, where these policemen were on the police radio when this happened. It was in Ohio, and they heard about a UFO, and they laughed and everything. And then they saw it, and it was right over their cruiser. And they radioed into the office, to the police office, and they were on the radio the whole time this happened. The police office said, shoot it, and they didn't. And anyway, they followed the thing through Ohio and into Pennsylvania. There were all kinds of witnesses. There were a lot of other policemen and everything else. And Blue Book said, well, they were following Venus or a satellite or something, which wasn't anything like what they described at all. And things like that, I think, just were really far out, and it ruined the life of the people that described it, because they were on the radio and there were a lot of witnesses watching it. And Blue Book would say, somebody'd see a landing or something, and they'd say, oh, that's, a lightning ball or a thunderstorm or something, when it just made no sense at all compared to what they actually reported.
And when I talked earlier about Hynek being very critical, he was overly critical. He actually wrote about it, and there's plenty of information and plenty of critiquing that he did on the whole project. But originally, do you think that maybe the Air Force thought that that project would be short-lived and they would jump into it, debunk the whole UFO phenomenon, and it would be over and done with?
Yeah, I don't know why they were debunking it. The only thing I can figure out is that maybe they were getting real good information and they didn't want the other countries to know, and so they wanted to keep it secret. It started out in the military, and the military has everything classified. And I think at first with UFOs, they thought that these might be Russian or from some other country. And I think that's how it got classified to start with. But then it continued to be classified. And so there's the debunking part, which may have been, organized to throw other countries off and think, well, we don't know anything about it, when they were actually collecting information. That's the only thing I can think of, because I don't know what they were debunking, because somebody should have been concerned about it, I think.
I think my frustration, and probably others, is the fact that we'll probably never know what they found out. And it would be nice if that info was made public, but I mean, who would be the deciding person that would make it public?
Well, it seems to be becoming a little bit public now with that information from the NAMUTs and that information, from the Tic Tac object and all that.
Right. We got a little bit of time left. I'd like you to talk about your other books really quick, and because that's how I originally discovered you, and I want to read, of course, Sacred Corridors, which is available. But tell me about the two previous books that you did on UFOs.
The first one was called UFOs Today, 70 Years of Lies, Misinformation, and Government Cover-Up. And this was about the cover-up, and I started right at the beginning of ufology and went all the way through, including this SR-14 study and everything up until practically today, and just mention the cover-up and how it might have started way back. And the second one I wrote is called Inside the Lightning Ball, and it was my own experience and those of scientists.
Have you ever had any criticism from unknown sources that you would expect to be military or government agencies?
If I did, I didn't pay attention to them, so I don't know.
That's a good idea, but I often wonder that people who had actually worked with and closely with the government, who came out and written different things in books about their experiences, if they'd ever had problems or were ever contacted about the stuff they had written, did you ever have to request clearance for that?
No, because I never said anything real classified. I had some interesting things happen, though. When I had been on Wright-Patterson and I'd taken pictures in the secured area of the buildings, and I published them in a local UFO publication that the local group had. And I sent back to the archivist. And we thought there were moles in our local group. Anyway, what happened was that it was published, and about 3 days later, a T-38, which is a supersonic jet, came flying up my road and dived on my house. I mean, it dove right at my house so that my house was shaking and everything. And it was just like, I thought the end of the world was going to happen. And I grabbed one camera and I got out and I sort of lived by a park where you wouldn't do that. And there was a stunt pilot up, and I got the picture of the jet and the stunt pilot was at once, and I ran back and managed to get my camcorder loaded and ran back out and got a picture of the airplane. Got some good enough pictures that people could identify what airplane it was. And then I ran to my neighbors who were standing outside with their mouths open, and I asked what happened. The neighbor said, "It dive bombed your house." And it dove right at my house and came up over a park where there were model airplanes and things like that, and circled for a while and left. And this is a military plane, and you don't dive at civilian areas like that. And I had it all on tape. I mean, I put it on YouTube. And so I wondered if something was going on there. And some other people had some experiences too. It was pretty weird.
Interesting. Are you in the works right now? Are you writing anything?
I just had a
UFO
book
related
accepted today, and I was very, very happy.
Right on. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Any idea when that'll be out?
Not maybe next year, or I hope it's this year, but it won't be immediately.
Is there a hint of what we can expect?
I was working on the Pascagoula, if you know what that is.
Absolutely. I've had Calvin on the show.
Good. I mean, I sure you did, but anyway, I had been studying a part of that for a very long time, and there was a wave and a lot of odd things that happened at the same time as they had that abduction. And it was actually the first thing I ever started on, even before I was in UFO, studying UFOs. And so, anyway, this is about the other things that happened at the same time as the Pascagoula abduction, and it was pretty weird. A lot more happened than that.
Yeah, there's a lot of information there that needs to come out. I know that that they're working on it, and Galvin has met some new witnesses, and there's more information there. It's becoming more and more interesting, especially the fact that he's actually come forward and is talking about it now and writing about it. And so, yeah, that's one thing I'm following very closely. I've
been, with his book and interviewing some of the other witnesses, and everybody to me sounded very credible.
Right. Very, very interesting. Philip is working on that very hard, and he's done a lot, and pretty amazing guy, and he's published a lot of books for a lot of nice people that are fascinating and brilliant, and it's always exciting to see what he has come out. Philip Mantle, to see what Philip Mantle has next up his sleeve.
Yeah, he's awfully good.
There's always something.
Yeah.
So where else can we find you online? Let everybody know about you, or your website, and where else they can find you.
My website is irenascott.com, and I have all my books listed. And I'm on Facebook. I'm in some academic ones like ResearchGate and LinkedIn, and those too.
Excellent. My guest tonight has been Dr. Irena Scott. The book is called Sacred Corridors, and I'd like to just say to Dr. Scott, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much.
My Alien Life Podcast.
You can find my website at www.myalienlifepodcast.com, and please subscribe to my latest downloads at iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and at podbean.com. And please follow me and like me on Facebook and Twitter. My Alien Life is written and produced for broadcast at Studio 254 in the Northern Rocky Mountains. The music you are hearing is produced and created by Elion. You can find all Elion's work online at Heart Dance Records.